Good afternoon. The question is, would you explain the meaning of getting a strong odor of incense in meditation? God is infinite, and God manifests itself in infinite forms, in infinite ways. God is consciousness, and we become aware through the activity of consciousness. We see each other, we hear each other, we taste or touch or smell each other. But actually it is all an activity of consciousness manifested at 5 different levels of experience. And so it is that in meditation it is possible sometimes to see. Other times it is possible to hear the still small voice. And then there are other times when the presence makes itself known through the activity of smell and even touch. Very often a person is touched in meditation. They feel a touch on their shoulder or on their head or on their cheek. At other times the perfume of flowers is noticed. And there is no way to limit and say, oh no, God cannot appear this way. Oh yes, God can appear in any form. And probably we can understand that best by the question that was asked of Joan of Arc. Does God speak to you in French? And her answer was, I hear him in French. And so it is. Does God speak as perfume or odors or voices or touches? No. But we comprehend God in these ways. That represents our interpretation of God's presence. Let us learn to accept God in whatever way and whatever form God may appear to us. And how do we know that it's God? How do we know that it isn't imagination? By the fruitage, by the result. When we are indulging vain imaginations about our spiritual activities and spiritual work, it leaves us up in the air with no tangible result. But when our experience is actually a spiritual one, when it is actually one of God, you can know it by its fruits, and you know the fruits of the Spirit: joy, peace, prosperity, health, harmony, love. And when these experiences bring such things into our lives, then we know they're of God. And this is along the same line. All my life I have been conscious of God's presence, the most when in the midst of beautiful views of the sea, mountains, or farms. Now when I'm in the silence, many times there are words come to me, as you say, will come, but for the most of the time, that slowing of the breath or a release comes, and then comes a beautiful vision of mountains, river, or sea. And I have the feeling of complete peace and well-being, and the feeling that I have truly been in touch with God. Yes, I would consider that you have been in touch with God, since actually the presence has announced itself, and then through that touch of the presence there comes this sense of serenity, tranquility, peace. And I'm sure the devil would give us none of those things. will there ever be a return to the formless? Or is the formless the reality now? I know very little about formless. I doubt that there is anything that is formless. Everything has a form. Thought has a form. All substance must have a form, though not a visible form to our human sense. And so I would imagine that the higher we go in spiritual realization, the more we see the spiritual sense of form rather than the material sense of form. And probably that is what the question meant. Yes, the higher one goes in spiritual unfoldment, the more aware they are of spiritual form, of spiritual reality. And by that I mean this: a person of purely material sense of view, sitting up here, would look out and would see faces and figures, and hats and dresses and suits and eyeglasses and earphones. Now, as a person rises higher and higher and higher, they become less aware of these things and more aware of a look in the eye, a smile on the lips, a flick of the finger. All of those things come into view. You'd be surprised how you'll be looking in this part of the room and over here catch a glint in someone's eye, or a smile as they recognize some spiritual point that they've always known and are now hearing it brought to their attention. And so you become less conscious of men and women, and you become more aware of these outer symbols that are expressing their inward being. And then there comes a stage when you continue to rise above even that, and almost unaware of people sitting out as human beings, you sense or realize the spiritual nature of their being, and it comes to you in this wise. Usually on our first night of a class or day, there will be a sense of agitation in the air. You won't see it, but you'll just feel something stirring, and you realize after a while of experience in the work that it is because out here there are those who are not yet familiar with the nature of the infinite way message. And they come and they are hearing me through their Christian Science understanding. And the next one is hearing me through their unity understanding, or their New Thought, or their Oriental background understanding, each one interpreting what I'm saying from their previous standpoint. And so we have a whole series of sometimes conflicting thoughts. And by the time we're at the second session, that has started to calm down, and by the third we're all in one place of one mind. And so there's no awareness anymore of any conflict out here. There's a great feeling of love, of oneness, of unity, of the pouring forth, backwards and forwards, of this flow of the Spirit. And now you can see that this question may have called that the formless, but it wasn't formless. No. It's well formed, well defined, and just as that unrest had a form, so has this present peace and tranquility that we have. It also has a form. Last night, the form was tremendous. It was a silence and a peace, but it was as concrete as if you could see it. And so the answer then is that there will be not a return to the formless, but a recognition of spiritual form rather than material form. Should we discard the meditations and aphorisms we have employed before in favor of the listening meditation we have had in this class? Oh, no. No, we should go from glory to glory. We should give up nothing. We should adopt nothing. We should go from one state of consciousness to another. And here is an opportunity to explain previous meditations and aphorisms. We have referred to this before, that our entire existence represents states and stages of consciousness. There is nothing right or wrong in our experience. There are states and stages of consciousness, and in one state of consciousness we do one thing one way, and another state of consciousness we do it in another way, but one is a growth, a development from one into another. Now, you will notice in my writings that every book and every manuscript has a chapter on treatment and on meditation. And if you read them hurriedly, you may think that there are too many treatments, and how can you learn all of them? And some of them even seem to say to give up what is in another one. That's true. That is true. These treatments are for us at our level of consciousness. And it may well be that there are treatments that you will find, or methods of treatment, modes of treatment, in the writings that fit exactly where you are in consciousness now and will make an ideal idea of treatment. And others may seem completely out of line with your thought or your ability. But that doesn't mean that next week or next year that you will not discard the treatment that is so important to you now and see the wisdom of another one further on in the book. But on the same way, we have had this week a form of treatment and a form of meditation, and both of them make use of words, thoughts, ideas. Both of them bring into being statements from Scripture or from metaphysical writings, and then lead to a period of listening when we do not use words or thoughts, but rather listen. It is explained this wise. Our lives tomorrow will be the same as today. Next year will only be a repetition of this year, unless there is a change of consciousness. And the chances are there will not be a change of consciousness unless we individually and specifically do something about it. Now then, if we accept truth teaching, we must understand that just reading books of truth or hearing lectures of truth will have only a slight effect upon our experience. It is the practice of these truths that begins to change our consciousness. And so let us assume for a moment that we have just learned that thy grace is sufficient for me. Now, up to this moment, we haven't known that. We have thought that we had to labor. We had to plot and plan for our future. We had to worry and fear and doubt and be anxious. Perhaps we have had all kinds of human anxieties and thoughts and fears about ourselves and our families and our future. And here comes an idea that is presented to us that thy grace is sufficient for me. And we stop short and say, is that true? Does that mean that? Does that really mean that God's grace is enough without my doing all this worrying and planning and thinking and scheming? Is that really true? Have I been wasting a lot of time and energy in useless taking thought, when all of the time there was a divine grace at hand that could provide my sufficiency? And you do a lot of thinking about this, and finally you come to the conclusion, well, I will have to prove it for myself. And then you begin to have problems, probably more than yesterday even. And with each one, you bring to conscious remembrance this truth. Thy grace, God's grace, is sufficient for me. I better lay off worrying for a while. I think I better stop being anxious for a while. I've just been trying to know that God's grace is sufficient, so I'll let that worry for tomorrow. I'll put off that taking thought for tonight. But right now I rest in the truth that God's grace is sufficient. And you relax, and you rest, and you feel at peace. But that doesn't mean that tonight, tomorrow, the day after, that you aren't going to have more anxious moments and more concern and more lack or more fear or more pain. And there again, you come right back to your treatment. God's grace is sufficient. I must rest in God's grace. No anxiety, no fear, no doubt, no thought. And so you'll find that you may go along that way for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. And all of this while, you are meeting every appearance of discord with that treatment, that remembrance, that divine truth that God's grace is sufficient. And lo and behold, just a few days or weeks or months, and you begin to feel God's grace coming into expression. You find good coming to you that you hadn't humanly planned for. You find harmonies, health coming to you that at the moment you may not be able to explain. But with the passage of time, it settles, it dawns in your consciousness, why, that is true. God's grace was sufficient for me. And by that time, you have come to a place where you no longer need as many affirmations or denials or as many of these truth statements. You rest more in that sense of peace. But then perhaps there comes another problem, and let us say that this time it is a great responsibility that comes to you, and you have the feeling you cannot perform it. You cannot do it. It's beyond your means, or it's beyond your strength, or it's beyond your time, or beyond your powers. And along with that comes the remembrance of a passage of Scripture. And we hear that He performeth that which is given me to do. And that startles you for a minute. What? What? He performeth? I've been given this job to do. I have been given this work, or I have been given this responsibility. And here Scripture says He performeth it. And there again you see, while you go about the performing of your task, you have these occasional reminders, it's all right, I can do it because actually He is performing it through me. And again that responsibility drops away, that rest comes, and soon you find actually it is true. There is a He at the center of your being. He that is within me is greater than any responsibility or duty or demand that can come upon me from the world. And so again, while at first you have been diligent in the use of your statement of truth, you have brought it to your awareness over and over and over again, but now you find that only occasionally do you have to remind yourself of it, because now the words have given way to the actual awareness itself. And when you have the awareness, you don't need the words. Well, so with our forms of meditation or treatment, I have said to you this week that when we go into our meditation or treatment, we have these statements of Scripture or statements of truth, and then we come to a place where we rest and listen for the still small voice. Now, it may be that when you first undertake this form of meditation or treatment, that you may be calling to conscious remembrance every statement of truth you know. It may take you a half hour, 3/4, or a whole hour to give your part of the treatment, that is, your voicing of the truth. Then you sit back and, Father, speak, Father, thy servant heareth. Take over, and you listen, and that part of the treatment may be 1 minute or 2 or 3 or 5. Ah, yes, but as you continue this form of treatment, you will gradually get to the place where your part of the treatment only takes 5 minutes and God's part takes a half hour. It just reverses itself. God keeps filling you with its truth. God keeps filling you with the realization of its presence. But you have made way for that by your preparation in, let us call it, the letter of the truth. We call this the letter of the truth and the spirit of truth. The letter of the truth and the consciousness of the truth. So do not hesitate to bring to your conscious remembrance every statement of truth you know. Do not hesitate to repeat often these statements of truth as against the appearances of discord that come until you have built your consciousness to where that is no longer necessary. And so you see, you do not discard, you just evolve. You grow gradually from one form of treatment to another, one form of meditation to another, and we hope in time come to the place where it is only an occasional occasion that requires us to remember some truth. For the most part, truth is imparting itself to us from the infinity of our being, sometimes in the form of quotations that we already know, and very often in forms that we never heard of before. You see, there come always 2 parts to our spiritual life. There is the part that we develop through the reading of truth, through classes of truth, through hearing truth, through treatments with truth, through conscious remembrance of truth. That is the activity of truth in our consciousness for which we are responsible. That is the activity of truth that we bring to this work. And if we do not do it, we will not develop a higher consciousness than we have at this moment. And that is why if you give 1 hour a day to the reading or study or statements of truth, you are increasing your consciousness in some degree. But if you give an hour twice a day, you may be assured that you are increasing your consciousness of truth measurably and immeasurably and measurably and immeasurably. But when the time comes that you're giving 3 hours and 4 hours, then you're really bounding into a new and higher state of consciousness. And eventually this passes, and you learn how it is to pray without ceasing. When that time comes, here's what happens. Every time you hear a news broadcast, every time you see a headline, every time somebody brings you a story of bad news, automatically you just turn it off with, "In God's kingdom, harmony reigns." And that's how you pass off bad news. When you witness sin, disease, lack, limitation, death on the street, in the bus, wherever you may be, you automatically turn it around and realize, no, that can exist only as a picture in the human mind, not as any part of God's kingdom. God's kingdom could never be responsible. God's kingdom could never hold any such pictures as that. And so you are praying without ceasing, and yet you are doing it without consciously going around declaring truth, except as the pictures of sense touch you, and you automatically learn to reinterpret them, turn them back into their spiritual value. And then it is possible to reach the height that is described in Scripture when a woman pressed through the throng and touched the hem of Jesus' robe, and without him even knowing that she was there, she was healed. In other words, he was living in such a highly exalted state of spiritual consciousness that he wasn't even aware of a sick woman around. And in that exalted state, she was healed without any conscious thought from his mind, without any conscious statement of truth, but without question, because of the years of training in which he had lifted himself, because of the 40 days spent in the wilderness so often, in which he lifted himself into that exalted state that he didn't see any error around to deny. When you get to that state of consciousness, where you never see, hear, taste, touch, or smell any form of error to deny, you are then in a state of consciousness where your treatments and your prayers are wordless, but believe me, you are treating and praying all the time. Is that clear? Don't hesitate. Any of these questions that are answered, if they are not answered so that you understand them, just write them out for the next session and let us again come, because we are not here for entertainment, you know. We are here for instruction and the uplifting of our consciousness. Is there anything to having our hair cut short, or is there more strength if the hair is not cut? Oh, there is no power in anything in the external realm. All power is in God. The hair has no power, no strength. Even the body has no strength. Even muscles have no strength. And I don't care if a man has exercised for 20 years, his muscles still have no strength. And the proof of that is just find him when he's asleep or unconscious or dead, and you'll see how powerless those muscles are. Life is the strength of our being, and it is life that governs our hair, life that governs our heart, liver, lungs, digestion, elimination. It is life that governs our strength, and if a person has enough realization of life, they can, even without exercise, lift heavy weights. But muscles in and of themselves have no strength, nor has the body in any way. All life is God. And God's grace is my sufficiency, even of bodily strength that applies. In the meditation, if no statement of any kind comes, is that just as satisfactory as 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 statements? Yes. Again, the statements are effects of the presence. What is power is the presence itself. So it is not necessary that we have any statements. It is not necessary that we smell any of these odors of the Spirit. It is not necessary that we see visions. It is only necessary that in our quiet that we feel a sense of peace, at oneness, warmth, and that's enough. It's just a realization of the presence. The presence is power, not the forms that the presence assumes. During treatment, when one feels a presence, do you rule out the possibility of this presence as being an etheric entity, possibly a teacher? Now, you can't rule out any possibility, since God is infinite. All you can do is know by the fruitage whether or not you are having a dream or whether you're having an actual God experience. And the fruitage is the only test. And the rest of the question is about superconsciousness and subconsciousness, and I know nothing about them because naturally I have no belief that such things exist. And nowhere in spiritual literature or spiritual revelation is there any reference to a subconscious or a superconscious or any other kind of a consciousness except the one consciousness, which is God. Only psychology and mental sciences divide the mind or divide consciousness, and that has nothing to do with our work. That is work on an entirely different level. We are dealing with one infinite consciousness called God. That consciousness is your individual consciousness and mine. And there are no degrees to it, but there are degrees of our awareness of it. And that comes because of the word I. When the word I, somewhere back in history, was used to introduce John, Mary, Joel, that was when we set up a mind apart from God. And that is called the experience of the prodigal. Now then, if we say I, Joel, we are referring to a certain state of consciousness, a state of God consciousness, but it may be a limited one, because it would be limited to Joel's concept of what consciousness is or of what his own consciousness is. Now, supposing that we were to accept the human view, that our consciousness is made up of our prenatal experience, our environment, our education, and personal experience. And then we were to say, that is my consciousness. Now, of course, that is a very limited sense of consciousness, and it would limit me forever to the prenatal influence, the environmental influence, the educational or the personal experience influence, and always throughout my life I would have to move in that groove of that consciousness. Now then, that is the way the human world divides us up. And it says if you are of certain prenatal status and had a certain environment, education or lack of it, and certain personal experiences, that you will move in that groove. And for the most part, people do. Until spiritual wisdom is brought to them in some fashion, and the revelation given that that's all foolishness. God is your consciousness. God is the measure of your consciousness. God is the circle, the circumference of your consciousness, and nothing less than the allness of God belongs to you. Now you see, your life begins to change. Instead of you looking back and saying, oh, well, I had no education or little education, or look what my childhood was and my family life, and so forth and so on, or my grandmother was a nervous wreck, and so forth. And now, all of a sudden, you come to the realization, wait a minute, what does that to do with me? I'm the offspring of God. God is my parent. God is my environment. God is my inheritance. Oh, I'm not limited to that personal sense of consciousness or subconsciousness or super. I am limited only to whatever limitations there are upon God, and that's none, since God is infinite. Well, now you begin to live from a new basis. Ralph Waldo Emerson states that in the first paragraph of his essay on history, in which he writes that there is but one universal mind, and that every man is an outlet to the same and to all of the same. Now, just think of that. Just think as if there were back here an opening out into the universal consciousness, and all that it knew, and all that it had, and all that it is pouring itself into you, and you were letting it come into you and pour forth through you. And then what would become of these inhibitions about your childhood or your education or your lack of it or your wealth or your lack of it, all that would be broken down instantly, and you'd say, flow, God, flow. Flow into me and through me and out into this vast world. And then you'd know the true meaning of humility. You'd know then that you had not only no limitations, but you could take no praise for your accomplishments, since it is all God pouring itself through. And then you'd really know that in all humility, there was absolutely no limitation upon your being. The subject of our work this week is self-completeness through God. Not self-completeness because of your education. Not self-completeness because you inherited a fortune. Not self-completeness because of some human circumstance or condition, but self-completeness through God being your life, God being your mind, God being your soul and your consciousness, and with God as the infinite nature of your being, what becomes of your limitation or mine? There's none anymore. That all disappears and it all goes. So, the nature of our work, as a matter of fact, the nature of the entire message of the infinite way, is the revelation of God as our individual capacity. In our Honolulu closed class, the subject of it was God as individual being, God as infinite being, and God as individual being, God as the infinity of individual being. And you will find through all the classes, through all the tapes, the essence of the entire message of the infinite way is that I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me, He doeth the work. Now, what works? Limited works? No. Infinite works. Infinite because of you or me? No. When Peter and John raised the impotent man at the temple gate beautiful, and the Hebrews would make something of it, the answer was, why marvel ye men of Israel? As though we of our own understanding or our own power had done this. Oh no, it was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the same Spirit that raised up Jesus Christ from the dead will quicken also your mortal bodies. Now do you see that? Do you see that until you wipe out all sense of limitation by believing that you are limited to a finite mind, a subconscious mind, a superconscious mind, or any other kind of mind, and realize there is only one mind, and that's God, and it is infinite, but we are bringing it through only in a measure. But that is only today. If we are not bringing it through in greater measure next month, that is our fault. We now have the teaching on earth enabling us to know how to practice the present until we can bring forth more and more spiritual fruitage through the realization that God is the only capacity we have, and therefore there is no limit to our capacity through God. That clear? Yeah. Make it clear. Make it clear. Understand it. Treat, pray, meditate on God as your mind, God as your life, God as the measure of your capacity, God as the infinite nature of your being. How could you be immortal or eternal? You can't be, except as God is immortal and eternal. And the immortality of God is the immortality of your being. There is only one immortality. How can you be loving? You can't be loving. Only God is love. But the measure of your love is the measure of God, since God is love. But to think that you have it in your power to be loving in and of yourself, or that you have it within your power to be generous or kind or just, oh no, you'd be going beyond the demonstration of Jesus Christ. May happen someday, but it hasn't happened yet. And he said, why callest thou me good? There's but one good, the Father in heaven. Don't call me a healer either, said, or a multiplier of loaves and fishes. The Father within me doeth the works, and so with us. When we learn that love is not a personal quality, we are able not only to love infinitely, but to be loved infinitely. It is only when we limit love to my capacity or your capacity that we find love very, very limited. It is only when we think of justice as being a quality of this man's character or that man's nature that we find it very, very limited. But when you see that love is of God, justice is of God, benevolence is of God, forgiveness is of God, there's no limitation to it anymore. And you have removed the egotistical sense of thinking that even though Jesus couldn't be good, I can be loving. Oh, no. You can't be loving. Neither can you withhold love, because God is love. And God is forever expressing itself as love through every open avenue. That we are. There is where the practice must come. Let us repeat that the statement, thy grace is sufficient for me. All right? All right. Now then, if that is true, and it is, it can only be made true in proportion to our having a feeling of its trueness. In other words, the statement in and of itself does nothing except gives us a feeling of hope or wonder or sometimes a question, is that true? But the statement, thy grace is sufficient for me, is a statement of truth, but it will not come into active expression until that statement of truth passes from being a statement to being an inner conviction. Now, as it came to me in that meditation, the thought came that thy grace is sufficient for me, but with it came this, then thy law must be sufficient for me, and I will have no dealings with material law, medical law, theological law, since thy law must be sufficient for me. Thy strength must be sufficient for me. And then is the question of the strength of my muscles. It isn't a question of my strength. Thy strength is sufficient for me, and immediately followed, thy love is sufficient for me. And all of a sudden I saw the horror of our looking to each other for love, our looking to our friends and relatives for love. And here, right before us, all the time, is the statement that thy love is sufficient for me. Now you see, as we would come into this awareness that God's love is sufficient for me, God's love would be made evident to us through men and women. Why? Because there is no God separate and apart from men and women. If you say that you love God whom you have not seen, and do not love your fellow man whom you have seen, you are a liar, says the Scripture. In other words, then, by first looking away from man and woman and realizing God's love is sufficient for me and resting in that, then God's love appears to me. But more than likely, it will appear as men or through men and women and children and the world at large, animals, birds, plants. It will come to me through God expressed as some measure of form. God's love. How about this? God's wisdom is sufficient for me. Is there any need then for being concerned about my wisdom or yours or our lack of wisdom? No, we're opening ourselves now to God's wisdom, is sufficient for me. And then a rest, a period of rest. And God's wisdom fills us, and God's love fills us. God's presence is sufficient for me. God's presence, oh, we've been thinking in terms of husband, wife, sister, brother, friend, or other relative, and here we are faced with the truth that God's presence is sufficient for me. Just think of that. God's presence. You know we don't believe that. You know we don't accept that as a rule. We talk in terms of God's presence and then turn around and cry our hearts out for some other presence. Sometimes even for some other absence of a presence. But the real truth is God's presence is sufficient for me, and as we rest back in that conviction, in that awareness, then God's presence appears to us as the presence of friend, relative, husband, wife, child, whatever it may be. And so it is, carry this treatment or meditation with you. Practice it today and practice it tonight and practice it tomorrow morning so that when we come together tomorrow afternoon, we will be able to have an experience like this of a statement of truth or a quotation of Scripture unfolding and unfolding and unfolding until it forms the perfect treatment or meditation. And so thank you, and let us have your questions tomorrow.